For Pacifica Radio, July 4th, 2024. I'm Scott Horton. This is Antiwar Radio. All right, y'all, welcome to the show. It is Antiwar Radio. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm the editorial director of Antiwar.com and the author of Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. You can find my full interview archive, more than 6,000 of them now going back to 2003, at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. And I'm here every Thursday from 2:30 to 3 on KPFK, 90.7 FM in LA. And happy Independence Day to everybody. Now, instead of justifying a war, we're going to oppose one. Introducing, again, Antiwar.com's news editor, news director, newsman, the great Dave DeCamp. Welcome back to the show. How you doing, man?
I'm good, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you here, and very sad to be talking again with you about the situation in Gaza. It's unbelievable, although predictable in its own way, too, that this war is still going on in July after kicking off last October. And this tiny little county-sized, very small county-sized strip of land on the eastern Mediterranean shore there, this Indian reservation, basically, where the Israelis have been slaughtering these people by the tens of thousands for just months and months on end. So I guess I want to start with what's going on in Rafah, which I gather is still the heart of the current battle for, I don't know what. It used to be claimed the policy was to eradicate Hamas. Now I don't know exactly what the battle is to do, since the Israeli government has announced that they know that they cannot eradicate Hamas, but now it's to at least fight them. And so if you agree, let's start there, or wherever the worst of the fighting is taking place now.
Well, the military has said that they can't eradicate Hamas, but you have Netanyahu still claiming that that is the goal. And
in other words, he's just writing himself a blank check to accomplish what his own military says is an impossible task.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. And the U.S. is still backing it 100%. So the fighting actually really escalated in the north and kind of central Gaza recently. Rafah has been cleared out of, about 1.3 million people fled from there and kind of scattered across Gaza. And there's been actually the big thing that happened this week was also in the south in Khan Yunis. Israel ordered another evacuation in that city, which they just recently withdrew from. Back in April, they pulled out and left the city, completely in ruins. More than 80% of the buildings were completely destroyed. So now it looks like they're going to go back in there. And I mean, it goes to show, they leave this city and declare victory over Hamas. And then they say, oh, well, we got to go back in. So they ordered this evacuation, which affected about 250,000 Palestinians in Khan Yunis, and many of them fled there from Rafah after the Rafah invasion. And so you've had these people, I was reading a lot of accounts of Palestinians in Rafah, before Israel started the big attack there, saying that they were displaced, 5 or 6 times at that point. So if some of them went to eastern Khan Yunis and were told to flee again, I mean, it's just really it's hard to imagine what it's like for these people. And Israel continues to bomb what they call, these so-called safe zones. There was one account of a family who left Khan Yunis in the middle of the night when they got this evacuation order. They went up north to central Gaza. Deir el-Bala is the name of the city there. And they were hit with an airstrike, and 9 out of 12 of the family members were slaughtered. And a lot of them were women and children. And there was more strikes in the El Mawasi camp on the coast, which was where they told the people in Rafah to go. So there's just no safe place for them. And it looks like strikes have kind of escalated more in a neighborhood in Gaza City, in central Gaza, and then now they're picking things up again in Khan Yunis. So it's not, you see the death toll that's reported by Gaza's health ministry. The daily death tolls around, a few dozen. You see like in the 20s usually. So it's not as bad as it was, in the early months of this thing, but it's still just relentless. And Israel announced last month that they were going to do these pauses to allow aid deliveries, but that hasn't, even Blinken the other day said that has yet to be seen, any sort of drawback from Israel. So it's just tough to know what's going to happen next. Now they're saying that the negotiations are going on again. Israel's looking at this latest response from Hamas. But I just read a report today from Ynet, from the Hebrew language version of Ynet, that says Netanyahu and his allies and, what they call the far right, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and these really extremist settlers are all working together to really sabotage the chance of a deal. And I think that's obvious to anyone who's been paying attention that's what's been happening for these past few months. So, yeah, it's just tough to say what, their kind of long-term plan is right now when you have them threatening escalation in Lebanon, and it's just a complete mess.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit more about the Al-Mawasi thing that you touched on for a second there. This is the area I remember seeing journalists post pictures and say, well, look, there's nothing here. This is basically just some sand. And this is where they're telling everyone who was fleeing Rafah, which had been the safe zone, supposedly, that now this is the safe zone. Flee Rafah and go here. But now you're telling me they're bombing that too.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically a tent city. And this happened. I was just on vacation for a couple weeks in Australia.
Airstrikes on tents, Dave?
As far as I understand it, this happened last week. It was June 20-something. There was a strike in this camp that killed about 25 people. And then there was reports of more strikes there, or kind of in the vicinity of the camp. Not sure about the casualties there. But, yeah, they've been – but, and there's other areas that are supposedly safe zones in central Gaza that they've been bombing as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's get back to the politics that you're mentioning there about basically the sabotage behind the scenes, no matter what they're telling the international press. CNN had a story this morning. Oh, it looks like they're about to make a deal. Biden went up there. I don't know if anybody really knows what was going on when Biden went up a few weeks ago and said, yeah, it's this Israeli peace plan, when it was apparently nothing of the sort. And then hilariously, he was still talking about it at the debate the other night, even though the whole thing was already dead on arrival anyway. But Netanyahu is in a coalition with the leaders of these, as you said, as they say, far-right parties, and particularly Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And anytime that Netanyahu even hints at something reasonable, they balk. And I'm sure he's in on that. That's sort of their game that they play. But even if not, give him the benefit of the doubt. That's part of him being in a coalition with them instead of more moderate forces, is essentially they can bring down his regime at any time if he's willing to compromise on anything. So can you tell us a little bit more about who these men are and their parties and how this has worked? Maybe a few examples of how this has worked over the last few months of the war?
Yeah, so I mean, these guys, both you mentioned Smotrich, and he's the leader of the Religious Zionism Party. And he is the finance minister, but he also has a ministry position in the defense ministry, where that basically makes him the de facto occupation governor of the West Bank. And we had Connor Freeman wrote a story about just the other day. Israel approved like the biggest land grab in the West Bank since '93, since the Oslo Accords. And they're advancing these settlements. And this is the result of having these guys who are settlers themselves, who live in the West Bank. And, for years have openly called for the annexation and the expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank. And they have very influential positions. And so Ben-Gvir is the Minister of National Security. He's the leader of the Jewish Power Party. And this isn't this is a really important position because he's in charge of the Israeli prisons, of the Israeli police and the border guards. And he just wrote this whole long thing on X the other day about, yes, I've been, cutting off food to the prisoners, basically saying, we have to start killing them, executing them to make room in the prisons. I mean, these are the people in charge of this stuff. And, they want to conquer Gaza. They want settlements in Gaza. Again, they're open about this. They go to these rallies, and they all dance and talk about how they want to take over Gaza. And we've seen, whenever there's any sort of peace deal, they threaten to sink the government. So for a little while, Netanyahu had Benny Gantz and his coalition as part of the emergency government, this emergency war cabinet that they formed after October 7th. But Gantz recently just left. And Gantz always kind of said, we could bail you out if these guys quit. But Gantz also doesn't seem interested in actually ending this thing. It looks like his whole move, I think, was just political. He thinks if he comes out against Netanyahu and quits, this is what I think his thinking was, make this big political show of challenging Netanyahu and then quit the government. And then in the future, that'll give him an edge in the elections, maybe, because right now Netanyahu's not popular, but people still support the war. So right now he's again completely beholden to these guys who can, at any time break the coalition and then, force elections. And all the polling shows that Netanyahu wouldn't stand a chance if there was an election. So I think as long as this is the arrangement, I don't think there's going to be any sort of ceasefire deal.
It's Antiwar Radio. I'm Scott Horton talking with Dave DeCamp from Antiwar.com. So Smotrich, by the way, if people go back just a year or so, he was the guy saying Hamas is an asset and the Palestinian Authority is a liability. They don't want a partner for peace. And that was the Netanyahu doctrine. That was the policy that failed on October the 7th.
Yeah, and Smotrich really spelled it out more than anybody, explicitly said that, they view Hamas as an asset. So I think an important thing, I know you've talked about this a little bit on your show, but so there, you mentioned the Biden thing. Biden came out with this big ceasefire proposal. It's pretty clear what happened, just from reading Israeli media. This is essentially what happened. Biden comes out and they claim this is an Israeli proposal. And it did seem like the Israeli, people involved in the negotiations might have, given it some sort of approval at some point. And apparently that deal was vague enough that Israel thought they could enter the first phase of it with Hamas, because Hamas's big thing is that they want a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal. And that deal was, first phase, 6-week ceasefire, initial hostage and prisoner exchange. And during that time, they'll negotiate the permanent truce. So Israel thought, okay, it's vague enough. We could enter the first phase and then restart everything after that. But Netanyahu came out and rejecting a permanent, constantly saying, basically saying he was against the deal. He was against a permanent ceasefire. And that led Hamas to asking for stronger guarantees. They wanted in the first phase, the beginning of the withdrawal and the start of the permanent ceasefire. And that's what kind of sabotaged it, was Netanyahu coming out and saying, no permanent ceasefire. And again, this is Israeli media, Israeli sources. The Israeli military is very unhappy about this, apparently. So I think it's clear that this is what's happening. How long can Netanyahu keep doing this and pulling this off? I don't know. I think he's looking forward to November when Trump will probably be elected. And you heard Trump at that debate. What did he say? Biden said, "Oh, Hamas is the only thing standing in the way of a ceasefire." And Trump said, "Well, what are you talking about? Israel doesn't want a ceasefire. They want to finish the job."
That was funny. And then he said, "You're a Palestinian. You love Palestine so much." And then he goes, "But they don't like you because you're such a lousy Palestinian," or something like that.
Yeah. So I do really think that that's a big part of the calculation here. I mean, but it's tough to know what Netanyahu's thinking because, a few weeks ago he comes out and he puts out this video. It seems like he's intentionally antagonizing the U.S. He says, "Oh, they're withholding all this military aid," which doesn't seem to be the case at all. So, is that him playing off maybe kind of the domestic politics here? Because you have all the Republicans in Congress are trying to, put themselves forward as this very pro-Israel party.
Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education.
People say to me, Scott, how do you get so much work done all the time? Coffee. It helps keep me from falling asleep. And it tastes really good because I get it from Moondo's Artisan Coffee at moondosartisancoffee.com. Moondo's is kind of the anti-Starbucks in that their coffee tastes real good. They have lots of great choices, representing all kinds of regions, blends, and flavors. I'm drinking the Ethiopian presently. Hey, wait, also, do you like saving money on good-tasting coffee? Right now, you can get 10% off and help support this show if you just go to moondosartisancoffee.com/Horton. Find the link and the QR code in the margin at scotthorton.org. That's moondosartisancoffee.com/Horton. It's Antiwar Radio, KPFK. I'm Scott Horton talking with Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, news.antiwar.com. And so tell me a little bit more about what's going on the West Bank here. You mentioned that this is Smotrich's deal is to expand the settlements on the West Bank where a two-state solution has already been made impossible, according to virtually every expert there.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of, I think, Smotrich's revenge for the Palestinian Authority supporting the kind of international legal action against Israel. They, encourage, or this is what Smotrich says, they encourage the ICC to go after Netanyahu. He was withholding the tax revenue. They just handed some over to the PA, but this is seems to be the excuse that they're doing for the expansions of settlements and everything. And of course, this is also going on with the backdrop of Gaza. So there's just much more attention on Gaza than the West Bank, even though, over 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. And that's the settlers taking advantage of the tensions and the attention off of them. So this is just the slow march toward annexation. It has been a slow march, but it's really speeding up.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about hunger. In Yemen, in that war, after not very long, I don't know when on the timeline, but probably, I guess, within the first year, I started calling it a genocide just because famine had begun, and it was a deliberate famine. It was inflicted by the United States through a total blockade, air and sea blockade, and then also Saudi, American abetted Saudi and UAE air campaign against their farms, against their food stores and marketplaces and everything. And so what do you call it when some nations deliberately inflict a famine on another nation? Genocide. So I don't know about all the quibbling over the term. I know most people think it just means a Holocaust, like the absolute worst case scenario. And then I guess you have to wait until it's over before you can use the G word or something. And then others will say, oh, no, you don't even have to have one single cold corpse on the ground. It could just be a mass relocation like what happened at Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh last year, where at least in the final stage there, no one was killed. They were just forced out. And so I don't know. I know a lot of people are curious about this, and I am too, not just where you, when or where you use the term or would you, but what really is the reality of famine in the Gaza Strip, which, of course, to whatever degree it is real, is being inflicted, again, by the United States of America, this time in alliance with Israel.
Well, it's tough to know, exactly what the situation is on the ground. As far as the numbers, the only thing that has been kind of officially reported is that a few dozen people, children, have starved to death, have died of malnutrition, a few elderly people as well. But I mean, you read accounts, this is, collective punishment inflicted on the civilian population. There's no doubt about that. you can't argue that that's not what's happening here.
And that's the Fourth Geneva Convention, 1949, direct violation.
And it's a war on children. I mean, the amount of children that have been killed, the estimate is somewhere around 15,000, but it could really be much higher. There was a thing Kyle Anzalone wrote up recently that 20,000 children are missing or so. So I think it's fair to call this a genocide based on that, based on just, again, the intentional war against civilians and children. And they are intentionally blocking aid. They kind of play this game with the U.S. that, oh, yeah, we're going to let aid in here. And sometimes some trucks come through. But lately it's been, as far as I understand, it's been a very small amount, basically since they captured the Rafah border crossing. The UN said that this latest evacuation order has also just completely upended again, the aid distribution. There's a lot of crime now. So you read accounts. There's a good article from Mondo Weiss about this, just an account of a Palestinian man trying to get food for his family. They can't afford, basically the only thing he can afford is canned goods. And this is, kids eating like this for, almost 9 months now. I think we probably will see a lot more deaths when it comes to malnutrition later this year if this thing doesn't end, because even if they're eating food, they're not eating nutritional stuff, and any sort of kid, and that's what the few dozen that have starved to death that we know about, at least they had other medical conditions, and if they couldn't get proper food, and it killed them. So I'm sure we're going to see more of that. It is tough to know the real scale of it. You have people, the fact that you have, you've had an American official, you've had the World Food Program official, Cindy McCain, say that there is famine happening, I think is enough, should be enough to stop this, but apparently it's not enough for Joe Biden. But yeah, I mean, there's just no question that this is a war. There is this starvation blockade, and this is collective punishment of civilians and children.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, you can see obviously the institutional interest that Cindy McCain has as the head of whatever nonprofit she's running there to do that. But it's also good that that's the position she's in. It should mean that people are willing to listen to her. So I don't know. Did Cindy McCain get in trouble for this? Did they call her an anti-Semite over it?
Not that I saw. No.
You're just going to try to ignore it until she says it again. We'll see. I bet she got some phone calls.
Her daughter, she was going off about, she's horrible on this whole thing. It's I bet. Just kind of funny.
Is she still on daytime TV?
I don't know. I've just seen her on Twitter. I have no idea what she's up to.
Yeah. Well, that'd be interesting if Meghan McCain got in the position of defending her mom's point of view on that, right? Someone ought to make some hay out of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no, I mean, I think Zionists she actually making her turn on her mom, which I'm sure they already are trying to do.
Yeah, probably. She was defending Israel or something. I retweeted her and I said, according to your mom, they're starving the Palestinians to death. So you should maybe talk to her.
There you go. When I said someone should, you already did.
Yeah.
The great Dave DeCamp, everybody. All right. Can you give us a brief tour around the region here, Dave? Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. In other words, the Iranian-backed Shiite alliance.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, Lebanon's the big one right now to watch. Over the past few weeks, few months, there's been all these threats from Israel, basically saying that they're ready to invade. There's been all these reports saying that they're planning to invade in this month in July. But on the other hand, their military is not really ready to open up a new front. And this is something, there's this big report in the New York Times about the Israeli generals, the top brass. They all want a ceasefire in Gaza. And part of the reason why is so they can prepare for war in Lebanon. And this is, so I think Lebanon's kind of the big one. And if Netanyahu does decide to go ahead with some sort of incursion or invasion, you have Iran has been basically saying, you don't know what's going to, we could all, the resistance axis, is going to get involved is essentially what Iran is saying. So that could really explode. And what's really concerning is that there's this guy named Harrison Mann. He was an Army major who resigned from the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency over the Biden support for the genocide in Gaza, for the slaughter in Gaza. So he was just in the Pentagon in as an intelligence analyst, and he's saying he thinks that they might go ahead with it, and it's basically Netanyahu wanting to continue to be a wartime leader, so there's not election, so he's basically saying he needs that to stay in power. And he's also saying that Hezbollah could hit Israel very hard to the point where it might make the U.S. intervene directly, where he thinks that Biden's not going to be able to sit out if Israel's really getting hit hard in the north. So that is concerning to see someone who is, again, just in the intelligence saying that. And he said, the least escalatory step that the U.S. could take is hitting Hezbollah supply lines in Iraq and Syria, basically hitting the Shia militias. But, when this thing pops off, you never know what that could turn into. So that's the big thing to keep an eye on. Iraq and Syria, when it comes to like attacks on U.S. troops, that's been pretty calm lately. The militias have been, firing some drones and things toward Israel. I don't think they've really been doing much, but their threat, they're gonna funnel into Lebanon if Israel invades. So if Israel invades, we might see a big escalation of Israeli strikes in Syria and Iraq as well. And in Yemen, same thing continues. The month of June was actually the most Houthi attacks on commercial shipping of the year. So that hasn't de-escalated at all. The U.S. bombing campaign has been a total failure. So that's still happening. They're kind of more of their own entity, the Houthis, than the militias in Iraq and Syria, which have toned down, because at Iran's behest, basically. But yeah, so that's the situation. Lebanon's the big thing to keep an eye on.
Didn't I tell you guys that the Houthis are not Hezbollah? That was how Joost Hilterman put it in foreign policy back in 2014, 2015, that they're not the sock puppets of Iran the way Nasrallah and Hezbollah are. And the Ayatollah might ask them nicely, but they don't have to say yes to him. They're Shiites, but they're a different kind of Shiite. And they're just, Hezbollah was almost sort of kind of founded by Iran. You know what I mean? This is just a whole, Hezbollah is Iran's 51st state. The Houthis are not. Ansar Allah are not. And so the degree of control there is more of a bribe than true loyalty to shared agendas, But yeah, anyway, if real war breaks out in Lebanon, I see what you mean, that the dominoes could fall down real quick if Hezbollah hits Israel hard enough that Joe Biden calls out the B-52s or starts, really hitting targets in Syria and Iraq as well. That could tip the whole thing into regional war right there. I don't know. The Ayatollah doesn't want to fight. After he dies of old age and we have a new Ayatollah, it'll be a different game. I know this one does not want a war, but it doesn't mean he won't fight one. All governments got their red lines, as we've seen. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, it's not, and I think another part of Netanyahu's thinking is that if there is a big regional war, then he can, kind of do more of what he wants in Gaza.
Yeah, then he can finish the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, too, while America's busy fighting Iran. Yeah. Hey, why not? Just build a railroad, put some boxcars on there, and ship them east for the Lebensraum. Mm-hmm. It's Jordan, Trans-Jordan. That's the real Palestine, Dave, don't you know?
Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry. We're over time and got to go. But thank you so much for your time as always, man. Great to talk to you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me.
All right, you guys. That's the great Dave DeCamp. He's our news editor over at Antiwar.com. That's news.antiwar.com. And I'm Scott Horton. I am the editorial director over there. And I am here for Antiwar Radio every Thursday from 2:30 to 3 on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. See you next week.